and I'm going to introduce you, Martin, and let you introduce yourself, particularly with specific request to Fredrick Buechner. But Martin has been a member of this church and a member of the Board of Deacons for Religious Education. He has preached several times and will be preaching again this spring, and authored, I've lost count, Martin, 9 books maybe. Former president of the Andover Newton Theological School, pastor in Wellesley and in Burlington and in several other ports of call. And we are thrilled to have him as a member of the church, but also as our presenter today. I'm going to admit Mandy, and we are ready to go, Martin.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm really not sitting outside, although it looks like it. This is actually an interior wall of our home in Woodstock, where I'm speaking to you from. So I'd love to begin by everyone introducing themselves. You probably know just about everyone here, but I would like to hear what your interest in this offering is. What made you sign up for this, and what do you hope to get out of it? And if you have any familiarity with the writings of Fred Buechner, I'd love to know that, so I know kind of what we're starting with here. I'm Martin Copenhaver. I'm really excited to do this. I've never led a group in reading of Fred Buechner, who is one of my favorite authors. I think I have every one of his books, and he's meant a lot to me for a number of decades now. So it's wonderful to share that with others, and also I know that I'm going to learn by reading him with you. So grateful for that.
Martin, why don't I call on people so we have a nice, smooth transition? So a brief introduction, and we'll start with Margaret and Chris Jernstedt. And you all may unmute at this point.
I'm Margaret Jernstedt. Delighted to learn from Martin. I guess I've been imprinted by Paul Tillich and Martin Buber, and they affected me profoundly. And I think Buechner may be one of those people that I should learn about from. Thank you.
And I'm Chris Jernstedt, and I pretty much attend all of the book discussion or other deep discussion groups. Haven't read this particular book, but read the other books that we look at. Look forward to this.
Wonderful. Maggie, can you unmute and introduce yourself, please?
I'm Maggie Burnett. I'm a new member to the church, and I am looking forward to the discussion. I've read a little bit of Buechner, but he's been quoted more times than I can count in different discussions and sermons I've heard over the years. I know a little bit about his writing, but not very much about him, so I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Maggie. Roger and Lee, can you unmute yourselves and introduce yourselves, please? We're going to come back to the errands. Trish Jackson, can you unmute and introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. I'm Trish Jackson. I have read a fair amount of Buechner, and anything that Martin Copenhaver and Annie Malott think so highly of is a winner for me. And as Martin knows, I'm proud to have been baptized by his father many, many years ago. And I'm going to put my video off because I'm trying to do some walking while I'm here. So thank you.
Thank you, Trish. And thank you, everyone, for unmuting now. Bob Keene, can you unmute and introduce yourself?
Bob Keene. This is an author I had no idea about. And I'm excited, and I'm particularly excited that Martin is going to bring it into my life. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Kathy Wilkerson, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, Kathy Wilkerson, member of the church, and I go along with Bob. I don't know very much, except Bob does know a lot. I don't know very much about this, but I also know it's excellent. And yeah, I'm all for learning new things and meeting Martin, who I haven't seen at church, but perhaps I will. But thank you.
That's perfect, Kathy. Thank you. Susan Mullins, can you introduce yourself?
Susan Mullins, and I was going to ditto what Bob Keene said, but I actually have to ditto what Kathy said because Bob doesn't know a lot. So
Susan, thank you. Rosalie, can you unmute and introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Rosalie Sainsbury. When the Christian Century article came out, I had read it and was intrigued by it. So when this opportunity presented itself, I availed myself of it, of course. I am not familiar with Buechner's work, but nevertheless, I look forward to it.
Thank you, Rosalie. Susan Spears, could you introduce yourself, please?
Martin, my husband was a Presbyterian pastor. I have to confess that I got to know Buechner secondhand because he was a great admirer of Buechner's, quoted him frequently. And so that's where my knowledge came. But I look forward to reading that Buechner 101.
Thank you, Susan. Catherine, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Catherine Coles. I joined the church about a little over a year ago. I am not familiar with Buechner, although I have to admit that I picked up the book and couldn't resist starting to read it immediately and was really bowled over. All I can say is that this represents a new interest for me. I'm an academic by profession, and so it's wonderful to have the time now that I'm retired to be able to read things that I've wanted to for a long time.
Thank you, Catherine. Dennis, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Dennis Robinson. I'm a member of the church. I was introduced to Buechner probably by Mandy. And I found a bunch of quotes, several books that have a bunch of quotes, and I've used them every time I had to do a devotional. So that's about as much as I know about Buechner.
Excellent. Thank you, Dennis. Tom Wilson, can you unmute and introduce yourself?
You're not unmuted, Tom.
Yep, he's unmuted. Yep. Somehow we can't hear you, Tom.
Turn your volume up, Tom.
Tom, we're going to circle back to you and give Mandy a chance to introduce herself.
So I'm Mandy Leib Freeberg, senior pastor of the church, and I was not raised in a Christian family. My parents were disaffected Baptist and Episcopalian, so there was some history, but and Buechner in many ways wooed me into Christianity. His language, his way of talking about the gospel that did not use jargon. And so I feel like he and Eugene Peterson have been the midwives of faith for me. And even though I'm going to shut my screen off in a second and go finish packing, I couldn't miss this class. So,
Mandy, thank you. Joan Wider, can you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Joan Wider, member of the church, and I'm interested in learning more about this.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joan. Megan, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm afraid I do not know anything about Buechner. I now am pronouncing it wrong, aren't I?
Buechner, like a bird beak.
Buechner. But every class I've ever attended with Martin Copenhaver has always been a joy. And unfortunately, this is the only class I can attend unless the in-person ones are Zoomed because I'm going to be out of town. But I'm looking forward to this one. So thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Megan.
Jan Asmus, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Jan Asmus, and I'm a member of the church. And I have a very, very good friend with whom I grew up in Dallas, and she's always told me to read Buechner, and I had never done it before. So this was my chance to live up to her expectations. So I'm looking forward to learn more about him.
Thank you, Jan. Tom Wilson, let's give this another try. Oh, rats. Tom, as long as you can hear us, that's the most important thing. So Dr. Tom Wilson will be back to us. Roger and Lee, could you unmute and give us a little introduction? And then Betsy, you're up. And we're gonna keep moving briskly, but Roger and Lee Errand are with us, as they are on almost all of our educational ventures. Betsy, we would love to have you introduce yourself. Betsy, you've unmuted, but we can't hear you. But as long as you can hear us, we may have a chance at the end to circle around, but I'm going to keep the pace moving briskly here and turn it back over to Martin.
Yeah, thank you. So this is first of 4 sessions, as I think you all know. 3 will be on Zoom, and the last one will be in person on the 15th of, or the 14th, I guess, of May. This particular session, I think, is going to be different because I'm going to do more talking than I hope to do in other times, because I really want to have this be a conversation, and will be today as well. But I'll probably take more of the airtime than I would otherwise, both to give folks a kind of a chance to catch up, to have a common base from which to work, and also to serve as a kind of introduction to Buechner. That if you have not received the email or have not had a chance to look at the article that was attached, I think it's worthwhile as an introduction. I won't be covering all of that, and there's no quiz, so no shame if you haven't had a chance. But if you do, I think you'll maybe find it helpful for some background. Just a bit about Fred Buechner. Really an extraordinary career. He died just last year at the age of 96, I believe it was. And a very long career. He was an instant sensation when he wrote a novel. He began it when he was in college and finished it soon after he graduated from Princeton. That was lauded as a great new literary figure producing this book. He likened to Marcel Proust and Henry James. Leonard Bernstein talked about wanting to set this book to music in an opera. And he was noted in all the kind of national magazines and all. And he was at that time just like 22 years old. A Long Day's Dying is the name of the book. If you look at that book now, it seems rather stilted. It's hard to know really, at least in my reading, what all the fuss was about. But at the time it was, and he never had the same kind of wide critical success with the secular public as he did with that book. And no book he's ever wrote ever sold as much as that first one. Which always kind of haunted him, I think, because between that first one and the second book, he had something of a conversion experience, which is related in that article, the Christian Century article, and went to Union Seminary and was ordained. And he thought that was kind of put the curse on his writing career, because people were always reading. Thinking that they're reading an ordained minister's work, so there must be some kind of agenda here, some kind of proselytizing going on, some kind of agenda. And if you get into his work deeply, you see that that's anything but the case. But he wrote in 4 different genres, really master of 4 different genres, which is an incredible thing, in sermons, in fiction, in memoir, and in popular theology. And he probably could have mastered the short story writing as well, because the only one he ever published, which he published right out of college, was in the New Yorker and won the O. Henry Prize, and never wrote any more short stories having done that. So his work has been translated like 27 languages. He wrote over 30 books. One of his books was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. That's Godric. We'll be reading section from that book, and another one was a finalist for the National Book Award. So he was much recognized. It's not long before you realize that Fred Buechner was a child of privilege. That kind of comes through in some of his writing. The most influential event in his life was his father's suicide when he was 10 years old. He writes about that at some length in his memoir, The Sacred Journey. It was only later in life that he was able to really talk about it, write about it, but that was a huge influence on his life. And it was his daughter's anorexia, one of his 3 daughters' anorexia, that sent him into therapy and concurrently started him on the path of writing memoirs, and both about his own childhood and then later in life as an adult. He had a unique ability, still does have a unique ability. Some people said here, quoted. I think he was the most quoted person, at least in the 80s and 90s, from Protestant pulpits of any person alive. I think that's fair to say, and in part because he was so insightful. Also, he had a wonderful gift for encapsulating thoughts in very few words. He was great with the beaux mots, like you can no more forgive yourself than you can sit in your own lap. Is one example, or doubt is the ants in the pants of faith. Just a very memorable, as well as longer quotes, or you see, I've got some of these in my head. Or the place you are called to is the place where the world's great need and your great joy meet. So he was able, and still is able, to appeal to a wide range of people in a kind of unique way, at least unique since C.S. Lewis. I think you have to go back to C.S. Lewis, a whole generation earlier, who also was able to appeal to kind of mainline Protestants, Catholics, evangelicals, and even more with the case of Buechner than C.S. Lewis, to doubters and skeptics. He cut his teeth in some ways by being, after a seminary, being the chaplain at Phillips Exeter Academy. And they had mandatory chapel in that day, daily chapel, and kind of a jaded group of teenagers. And Buechner preached to them week after week, trying to gain a hearing for the Christian gospel. They called themselves the negos, meaning they were negative on everything, these students. And Buechner attributes his experience there to why he had a passion for representing the Christian faith to people who are skeptical or have questions or doubts. Again, I think not since C.S. Lewis has there been someone who's been able to do that as well. I think it's Mandy saying, for instance, that he was a midwife for her. That's not a unique experience. He was an accessible and yet profound guide to people who are new to the faith, and as well as those of us who might be more steeped in it. He said he referred to himself as the skeptical old believer, or alternately, this believing old skeptic. And somehow both. That's one of the themes. So I want to say a few things about themes in his writing, recognizing that we're talking again about a number of genres. The book that we're going to be working with, called Buechner 101, is meant to be an introduction to his writings. And I could have maybe collected some different ones. I might have argued for some that were excluded and others that might have I don't think are as important to include, but it's a good sampling. And I think you'll get a feel for his writing from that book, because all the different genres are represented. And my hope is that at the end of our 4 weeks, that there might be a group of you, or all of you, who would like to continue to read Buechner, but choosing a particular book to dive into. This is more of a little sampling. You're going to get a little a little bit of just to whet your appetite, I hope, for more to come. Some of the themes that he worked with in various genres, and one of his books, which is now a book of devotions, has this title of "Listening to Your Life." Listen to your life. And I'm going to read a passage from this, because that is a common theme for Buechner. He says, "If I were called upon to say in a few words the essence of everything I was trying to say, both as a novelist and as a preacher, it would be something like this: listen to your life. See it for the fathomless mystery that it is, in the boredom and pain of it, no less than in the excitement and gladness. Touch, taste, smell your way to the holy and hidden heart of it, because in the last analysis, all moments are key moments, and life itself is grace. If God speaks anywhere, it is in our personal lives that he speaks." Please, I will not be changing his kind of male dominant language, but it is into our personal lives that he speaks. Someone we love dies, say. Some unforeseen act of kindness or cruelty touches the heart or makes the blood run cold. We fail a friend, or a friend fails us, and we are appalled at the capacity we all have for estranging the very people in our lives we need the most. Or maybe nothing extraordinary happens at all, just one day following another, helter-skelter in the manner of days. We sleep and dream, we wake, we work, we remember and forget, we have fun and are depressed. And into the thick of it, or out of the thick of it, at moments of even the most humdrum of our days, God speaks. But what do I mean by saying that God speaks? He speaks not just through the sounds we hear, of course, but through events in all their complexity and variety, through the harmonies and disharmonies and the counterpoint of all that happens. So, I mean, he goes on from there, but the idea that God didn't just reveal God's own self in some distant time and place, but today, and not just through words, but through the course of our lives. And so he really calls us to attention. It was Simone Weil who said, "Praying is paying attention." And Buechner, I think, would have approved of that. But it's paying attention to what's going on in our lives and listening for where the meaning might be. He says, is it just happenstance what's happening to us, or is there some kind of rhyme or reason to it? And he said, probably both at the same time. But so listen to your life. Another theme of his is that relationship between doubt and faith, and there are lots of places where that comes up in this little book, which is called Wishful Thinking. And it's a book where he takes various words and just defines them. So for instance, this one, doubt. It says, whether your faith is that there is a God and that there is not a God, if you don't have any doubts, you're either kidding yourself or asleep. Doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. They keep it awake and moving. He said elsewhere, if there were no room for doubts, there would be no room for me, he said. So I think he's very helpful to people in not only having a leaving room for doubt, but also affirming that the doubt can play a constructive role in the life of faith. Another theme of his, and particularly in his novels, but you also read it elsewhere, is he had a particular fondness for saints with feet of clay. And the more obvious the flaws, the more he seems to be endeared by these. He was very influenced by Graham Greene's novel, The Power and the Glory, with the central character of the whiskey priest, who somehow, in spite of his alcoholism, was able to be an instrument of God. And and his other weaknesses as well. But there was something about that really appealed to Buechner. And so a lot of his characters in his novels are just that. So, for instance, that book that I mentioned earlier, Godric, was very much it was a medieval saint with very much feet of clay, as is Brendan, another saint he wrote about. Of all the figures in the Hebrew Bible that he kind of latched onto the most was Jacob. And Jacob, you may recall, was a real rascal, and yet God worked through Jacob. He wrote a series of books about Leo Bebb, who was a bit of a religious huckster, working a diploma mill, and yet somehow God working through Leo Bebb. So he writes in an interview, or not writes, he responds in an interview. He said, somebody wrote him a letter. He said, he's taking me to task for making my saints have feet too much of clay. Why can't I write about a real hero of the faith? I answered one of his letters, then he wrote another wanting to keep the argument going. So my answer to him the first time was that any saint I write about would always have feet of clay, because they're the only saints I know anything about or that I could imagine. I don't think there are any other kind. I can't imagine a hero of the faith in the sense that he or she did not have shadows and darkness. So very much, and again, mostly in his fiction, but here and elsewhere in his nonfiction, that theme of saints with feet of clay. Another theme is finding the universal in the particular. Finding the universal in the particular. He says, in other words, if when we speak most personally from our own individual experience, we are perhaps most likely to then touch a universal nerve in the lives and experiences of others. And he said again in another interview, in another interview, he said, my story, talking about this in relation particularly to memoir, my story is important not because it is mine, God knows, but because if I tell it anything like right, the chances are you will recognize that in many ways it is also yours. It is precisely through these stories and all their particularity, as I have long believed and often said, that God makes himself known to each of us more powerfully and personally. I mean, this wonderful story that I told in that article that was sent out was of Fred Buechner and Maya Angelou, who were sharing the dais at a two-part conference. It was at Trinity Wall Street in New York, and then Trinity Cathedral in San Francisco, and they each presented Buechner and then Maya Angelou. And this was when Buechner was first starting to work on his memoirs, and they reflected the place of privilege that he grew up in, and kind of in some ways isolated, as privilege can isolate. But he wrote very movingly about his early. And the person who was MC of that said, as Buechner finished, he said, "Well, we're now going to hear a very different story from Maya Angelou." And of course, what he's referring to is Maya Angelou grew up in poverty, Black woman in the Jim Crow South, and of course, her experience is going to be different than Fred Buechner's, she assumed. And Maya Angelou got up, and the first thing she said was, "Well, my experience is exactly that of Fredrick Buechner." Again, there was something in Buechner's writing that had touched her at a very personal level, and so she related to it, even though their circumstances were very different. And that's what, and Buechner loved that story, in part because it reinforced his contention that if you speak most personally, you're also going to speak most universally. He was, an ordained Presbyterian minister who's very critical of the church, and he said this in an interview. But I know I have a friend where he spoke in his church and said almost exactly this when he was in the pulpit of the church. he said, and this is now Fred Buechner in an interview, but picture him standing in the pulpit of Trinity Copley Square in Boston, just having been invited to preach, and among the first words out of his mouth are something like this: "The best thing that could happen to your church is for it to burn down, and for all your fax and email machines to be burned up, and for the minister to be run over by a truck, so that you have nothing left except each other and God. And then I say, if you want to know what the original church was like, go to an AA meeting where all they have is each other and God, and they say to each other, we cannot live whole lives without each other and a higher power." Sing that in this grand church, and he also betrays in this his anti-technology. He never wrote email his whole life. He did eventually use word processing. After he'd written out his drafts in longhand, he would transcribe them on word processing. But when he refers to email machines, it shows he doesn't have much practice in that sort of thing. But then he could be quite struck by a random power. I remember he's talking about a children's sermon that he heard that just he talked about it with tears in his eyes. It moved him so, and I heard what he was recounting, and I thought, well, that just sounds like a children's sermon to me. I mean, it doesn't nothing extraordinary there. So there was a kind of mix of the critic of institutional church and also recognizing some of the points where God is evident. And I had fun thinking about, and I had never before done this, to really think about a comparison between Fred Buechner and another well-known clergy person, William Sloane Coffin. You may know of him, may have known him. He was, because he got around, he was the chaplain at Yale for many years and led the anti-war movement from there as the senior minister of Riverside Church in New York City, and very much a political activist and very influential minister. But interesting comparison, a kind of compare and contrast between those two ministers. They were born 2 years apart, Coffin in 1924 and Buechner in 1926. Both born to privilege. Bill Coffin used to say he was to the manor born, and they both came from very wealthy, privileged families. They both attended prestigious boarding schools. Bill Coffin was Deerfield and Andover, and Buechner was Lawrenceville. Both went to Ivy League colleges. Coffin went to Yale and Buechner went to Princeton. Both attended Union Theological Seminary in New York, where somebody mentioned Paul Tillich earlier. That's what, where Tillich taught both of them. Although Bill Coffin finished up at Yale Divinity School, he started at Union. Both of them married daughters of famous men. Bill Coffin married Eva Rubinstein, Archer Rubinstein, the pianist's daughter. And Fred Buechner married Judy Merck. George Merck, her father, was the scion of Merck Pharmaceutical and the source of much of the family's wealth. Both were renowned for their preaching, and both lived in small towns in Vermont. Bill Coffin on the Green in Stratford, Vermont, and Fred Buechner in Rupert, Vermont, which is near Dorset. But incredible differences between these two men as well. Coffin was a classic extrovert, and told that in the summer, near the end of the summer, he would get so restless because he wanted to be back immersed with people in ways that he wasn't in the slower summer months. And Buechner longed for solitude. He was a classic introvert, and and really was an artist of the interior life, rather than a person on the public stage who would see, as Coffin was. Coffin only started writing for publication later in his life, and Buechner, as I said earlier, started very, very early, publishing things that he had written in college. Bill Coffin could be he was very much off the cuff. You just launch him in a situation and he would have something to say. Wonderful kind of improvisational ability, gift of gab. And Buechner, anything but. He was always craft what he was going to say, and very carefully so. Coffin led institutions in one way or another. Some those two I mentioned earlier, as chaplain at Yale, and also as senior minister of Riverside Church, and later as executive director of an organization called Sane Freeze, which is a nuclear disarmament organization. And Buechner never led an institution, and in some ways chafed. The closest he came was teaching there at Exeter for I think 7 or 8 or 9 years, and then came to the hills of Vermont to focus on his writing. So there's I'm gonna close these kind of opening remarks, and I want to hear from you, any responses you might have. This this is from a book that you may not read, although I recommend all of his books, but this is directed particularly to preachers. It is his Beecher lectures on preaching that were offered at Yale Divinity School my first year there. I had never heard of him before, so I left town that week. and it wasn't until a couple of years later that I had a chance to meet him. But this book is telling the truth, the gospel as tragedy, comedy, and fairy tale. But I just love this description of the preacher and the moment of preaching, not just for the preacher, but for the congregation. So the sermon hymn comes to a close with a somewhat unsteady amen, and the organist gestures the choir to sit down. Fresh from breakfast with his wife and children and a quick run through of the Sunday papers, the preacher climbs the steps to the pulpit with his sermon in his hand. He hikes his black robe up at the knee so he will not trip over it on the way up. His mouth is a little dry. He's cut himself shaving. He feels as if he has swallowed an anchor. If it weren't for the honor of the thing, he would just as soon be somewhere else. In the front pews, the old ladies turn up their hearing aids, and a young lady slips her 6-year-old a lifesaver and a magic marker. A college sophomore home for vacation, who is there because he was dragged there, slumps forward with his chin in his hand. The vice president of a bank, who twice that week has seriously contemplated suicide, places his hymnal in the rack. A pregnant girl feels the life stir inside her. A high school math teacher who for 20 years has managed to keep his homosexuality a secret for the most part, even from himself, creases his order of service down the center with his thumbnail and tucks it under his knee. The preacher pulls the little cord that turns on the lectern light and deals out his note cards like a riverboat gambler. The stakes have never been higher. 2 minutes from now, he may have lost his listeners completely to their own thoughts, but at this minute, he has them in the palm of his hand. The silence in the shabby church is deafening because everybody is listening to it. Everybody is listening, including even himself. Everybody knows the kinds of things he has told them before and not told them, but who knows what this time, out of the silence, he will tell them. I mean, as a erstwhile writer myself, I just marvel at it just seems so delicious writing. I'll say one other thing, and that is when I was younger and first came in the thrall of Fred Buechner, I could not read his sermons before preparing my own sermon because I just thought, well, he said it. He said it just the way it should be said, and there's no other way to say it. And of course, I was able to get over that, but that's the way I felt about the power of his preaching. So, some thoughts that you might have in response?
We were introducing ourselves, and I forgot to bring it back around to me, but there were a number of influences in my fairly recent turn to ministry and call, and it wasn't just the intersection of my joy and the world's deep needs quote that I read from Fred Buechner. That drew me in a lot more, and at a critical early nascent time in my ministry. And so I count him as a major influence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. Other thoughts? I realize you've not had a chance to do much reading yet, but
I love thinking about his contemporaries and how he used language differently. He approached theology differently. He did not revere the church and the church protected at all costs, but in fact, looked at the church in some of the ways it may have gotten in the way of faith. And again, that attitude made me love the church because his faith was nurtured in the church. I know he came to faith later, but he heard because he was listening to a preacher. And so it's this really interesting push me, pull you of the value of the local church and the place of the local church, both to comfort and cast us out. And I hadn't thought about that in terms of the other scholars and theologians who were writing at that time and how different that was. So thank you so much for pointing that out.
yeah. Well,
I was just going to add to that. I think you might have a book in comparing Coffin and Buechner, Martin. I'll just say.
I'm sorry, what? I didn't hear that, actually. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, I said I was adding to what Mandy said, thinking I think you might have a book in play comparing Coffin and Buechner.
Yeah, well, two folks I greatly admired, yeah, but so they knew each other, of course, but and Fred was quite saying we're holding up different ends of the Christian project, and Bill Coffin was, for all of his wonderful work and as an activist and preacher and all that he was not as self-reflective. He did not pay as much attention in his writing, at least, to the inner life as Buechner. So in many ways, it's kind of a wonderful yin and yang with the two of them.
Margaret, go ahead.
Yes, Coffin was present in our church on occasions. In those few conversations, you were able to hear from him what he said at the time about significant life experiences, and whether we had them or hadn't was just so memorable. And everything you've said about Buechner, there was a really refreshing and real expressions. Thank you for this introduction.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Margaret. Yeah. Anyone else here? I see Lee looking for the mute button. Yeah, that's good. Mm-hmm. I'll give you this one example again of here. I showed you this book that's telling the truth, which is his Beecher lectures, and they were all already written ready to be published when he gave the lecture. So I mean, very carefully crafted. When Bill Coffin gave the Beecher lectures, they were also wonderful, but he was right before the lecture scratching notes on a legal pad, and that was what he was working from. That's what I mean by kind of very different approaches to.
I managed to unmute, so.
And
Oh, there we go.
then I think Rosalie may have had her hand up as well. So
Okay.
Lee, go ahead.
We were having problems, obviously, but the one thing that I remember from Buechner, I don't know where I first was introduced to him, was the definition of doubt. And that has stayed with me for probably 30, 40 years. And we have the only book we have is, oh, you mentioned the title of it a little while ago, but where he defines terms.
Wishful thinking, yeah.
Yeah. And so I look forward to becoming acquainted with more of his work.
So wishful thinking is, again, a kind of a dictionary, as it were, where he gives definition of a whole range of things, mostly related to faith and the Christian faith in particular, but not exclusively. And then he had a follow-on volume called Whistling in the Dark, where he redefined other words.
Oh.
And just a fresh take on all those things. And he really had a wonderful gift for capturing something in a very short compass. And
Martin, would you help me understand the difference between what he refers to as fiction and in terms of his writing, and why is he using fiction to still tell his stories and his examples rather than pontificating? I mean, was that just his style?
Yeah. So he, again, he really struggled with the contrast between how his first novel was received and how subsequent novels were received by the kind of secular press, because he was lauded so much for that first novel. They do, some of them, well, most of them deal with explicitly religious themes, but not in a way that is meant to manipulate the reader. It was John Keats, I think, who said, the poet John Keats said, we don't trust poems that have clear designs on us. You know, where the author is trying to get you somewhere. And I think Buechner didn't try to do that, but he tried to explore the faith in a way, and again, through these unlikely characters in most cases, which I think kept them from being kind of plaster saints. I don't know if that's mixing metaphor with feet of clay, but yeah. Does that help, Bob? If you were to read one of his books, you say, "Oh my goodness!" Again, this whole series of books he spent with Leo Bebb was one of his favorite characters, who was a kind of a shyster, and yet was the hero of these books. That somehow God was able to work through even someone like Leo Bebb.
Well, it was a matter of getting used to it, because I mean, I just about read the 101 book, and he's using fiction to lift up life in a raw kind of a way, and learn from that, and that's where we are. We're living life in a raw way, and so that's his technique. It sounds like he was getting away with it.
Yeah,
it was unlike reading somebody like Coffin, who was it was just different, and I was wondering how to read it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hopefully that's what you'll in part figure out in this time, and again, I think some of the characteristics that tie the fiction and the nonfiction and the preaching as well is his insistence that it be real, and sometimes that means raw, and everything from recognizing doubt to recognizing the flaws of his characters to he wants to make sure that it's not again, that he's being true to lived experience and not some idealized version of it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Which, again, when he says if there were no room for doubt, there'd be no room for me. I mean, I might say if there were no room for flaws, then there would be no room for me. You know, it's Margaret, I can't see everybody.
Yes, what you're saying there seems to be the challenge for all of us relating anything in religious institutional messages with real life.
Yeah.
What you're describing, what the fiction of our lives.
Yeah. It's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, the fiction that doesn't have specific designs on us except to provide a window to live. And Buechner would say that if there were such a window, if it's done well, you're bound to see God there, because that's part of reality. But you don't start saying, now let me try to introduce you to God and the Christian gospel and do it in the guise of fiction. If that makes sense. Anyone else? Great. Listen, what I would propose to do is that next time, and you're certainly, like Bob, very, it's wonderful to read on ahead in Buechner 101, but I particularly want you to, for next time, to read through page 56. And in that beginning section, you'll have an kind of introduction by Anne Lamott, who's a well-known author herself, and then a tribute by Barbara Brown Taylor, who's a very well-known author and preacher herself. Anne Lamott is not a minister, but a novelist herself, as well as nonfiction, and she's written some books of what would be called apologetics, which is interpreting the Christian faith for a general readership. So there's those two, and then there is a commencement address that Fred Buechner gave at a seminary, and then there's an excerpt from Sacred Journey, which is the first of 3-volume memoirs, really about his early life, and which is a marvelous book. If you are taken with that excerpt, I would encourage you to get that book. It's one of my favorites, and very much worth reading. But that's so for next time. My hope is that will feel very easy to accomplish, to read those pages. I think you'll enjoy your first introduction to his, or for some of the introduction to his writing. Anything else?
Martin, I have 1 or 2 bits of housekeeping when we get to that.
Okay, very good. Well, then I have maybe a third bit of housekeeping. Is that, Rob, I'd love for you to pray us out if we.
Good. All right. We'll first do a piece of housekeeping to facilitate your participation. There are books in the office. I will be in the office all this week. I'll be in there tomorrow. Kendra will be in the office, and so we can make them available to you. We also, I've taken attendance for today, so I will resend, Martin, your letter to this group, and that'll have the links to the Christian Center, to both articles, Christian Century and the other one that you provided. This Zoom link is a continuing link for the next 2 weeks, and all this time we are expecting as many as 6 or 7 people to join us next week who couldn't do it today. And this is, if it's a one and done, this was a great one and done to begin with, but we will be looking as this 4 sessions as a springboard to further book study and to further dialogue. With that, I'm going to ask one more time if there are any questions. Martin, back to you.
Yep, one other thing I neglected to mention, and that is that the Fredrick Buechner Center, whatever, I think that's what it's called, sends out an email every day with a devotional from his writing. And I would like to forward one of those to you most, if not all days, if you're open to it. If you prefer not to get something else in your email, just let me know at my email, which will be in that trail that Rob sends. But otherwise, I'll assume that you're willing to have something appear in your box, just another kind of sampling of his writing. And usually it just fills one screen. And I think it might be another way to be get a feel for his writing and benefit from his words.
Good.
Wonderful. And so you can be looking in a day or two from an email from me. And Betsy, you can email the church, or if you can find my email address somewhere, just so I can make sure to add you. And we will continue to do the work in between these sessions that will enhance what we do when we are together. I'd love to have you now join me in the spirit of prayer. Holy One, Great Spirit, God of many names, you have inspired poets, writers, scholars, exegetes, individuals like Fredrick Buechner, who for so many of us have opened ways to know you and to follow you and to discern your hopes for us. And Fredrick Buechner, in so many ways, did that, and we are grateful for his life and his writing, and for those who continue to share what makes him important and share their inspiration. We thank you for the books. We thank you for Martin's steadfast guidance of us. And we ask you to bless our inquiry, bless our scholarship, bless our skepticism, bless our faith, bless our hope, bless our desire to continue to be an Easter people and to walk in your ways as you are indeed being revealed to us. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Wonderful week. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you all.